In the mid-1970s, a young law student named Anne Rule sat next to a co-worker at a Seattle crisis hotline, a charming, articulate man who once spent hours helping her talk down a suicidal caller. Years later, she would learn that the same man, Ted Bundy, had been murdering young women throughout that period, sometimes on the very nights he had worked alongside her. Every file in this series has taught you to read behavior: a crime scene, a face, an interrogation room, an active offender's next move. This file turns that same lens on something harder to catch on camera, because it is designed specifically not to be caught. We are talking about the body language and the mask of the psychopath. This is not a video about calling your difficult coworker or your ex a psychopath. Real psychopathy, in the clinical sense we are about to define carefully, is rarer and more specific than the word's popular use suggests, and treating it carelessly does real harm to the science and to the people wrongly labeled by it. What this file will give you instead is the actual research, what clinicians look for, what the body reveals that words do not, and why the most dangerous person in a room is so often the calmest one in it. Stay with us through the clinical checklist. The courtroom controversies and the specific behavioral tells researchers have spent decades documenting, because by the end of this file, you will understand exactly what separates an ordinarily nervous, deceptive person from someone whose mask is doing something fundamentally different underneath. Popular culture treats the word psychopath as a synonym for evil, a label applied to anyone cold, cruel, or frightening. Clinically, the term refers to something much narrower, a specific, measurable constellation of personality traits and behaviors that researchers have studied systematically since the mid-20th century, with defined criteria, structured interviews, and decades of data on how it actually presents in real people, most of whom are never convicted of any crime at all. This distinction matters enormously for everything else in this file. When we talk about reading body language and behavioral markers associated with psychopathy, we are not describing a supernatural ability to spot evil on sight. We are describing a specific set of documented tendencies in eye contact, emotional mimicry, physiological reactivity, and conversational style that show up more often in people who score high on validated clinical instruments than in the general population. It is also worth stating plainly that most people who meet the clinical criteria for psychopathy are not killers. Estimates place the prevalence in the general population at roughly 1%, considerably higher in prison populations, but the overwhelming majority of psychopathic individuals never commit homicide. Many function successfully in business, law, politics, and other high-stakes professions, which is precisely why this file matters beyond true crime. The same behavioral markers profilers study in convicted killers also appear, in milder form, in people you may encounter at work tomorrow. Understanding the real research, rather than the Hollywood shorthand, is also what allows this channel to keep the promise we made in our very first file. Reading behavior responsibly means resisting the temptation to diagnose people casually, while still taking seriously the documented patterns that genuinely help investigators, clinicians, and ordinary people recognize real danger when it is present. The modern clinical study of psychopathy traces back largely to a single book, The Mask of Sanity, first published in 1941 by American psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley, based on his clinical observations of patients at a Georgia hospital who did not fit any diagnostic category available at the time. Cleckley's patients were not what people expected disturbed individuals to look like. They were often intelligent, charming, and superficially well-adjusted, capable of holding a normal conversation, securing employment, and presenting as entirely sane under casual observation. Yet beneath that presentation, Cleckley documented a consistent pattern, a profound absence of genuine emotional connection, an inability to feel authentic guilt or anxiety, and a repeated tendency to behave in self-destructive or harmful ways that seemed to serve no rational purpose, all hidden behind what he termed a mask of sanity, a surface presentation that gave no outward indication of the emptiness underneath. Cleckley proposed 16 specific criteria to define this pattern, including superficial charm and good intelligence, absence of delusions, absence of nervousness, unreliability, untruthfulness and insincerity, lack of remorse or shame, poor judgment and failure to learn from experience, pathological egocentricity and incapacity for love, general poverty in major affective reactions, and specific loss of insight into one's own condition. What made Cleckley's work so influential was not just the list itself, but his central insight. The mask was not a deliberate performance in the way a con artist consciously lies. Many of his patients seemed genuinely unaware that anything was missing, describing emotions in words that sounded correct while displaying no corresponding physiological or behavioral signature underneath. A mismatch between vocabulary and experience that later researchers would spend decades trying to measure directly. Cleckley's clinical observations were qualitative, built from careful case histories rather than a standardized scoring system. It was Canadian psychologist Robert Hare, working decades later, who transformed those observations into the instrument now considered the gold standard for assessing psychopathy, the psychopathy checklist, revised in 1991 into the version still used today, commonly abbreviated PCLR. The PCLR consists of 20 items, each scored 0, 1, or 2, based on a structured interview combined with a review of file information, such as criminal records, producing a maximum possible score of 40. In North American forensic settings, a score of 30 or above is typically used as the threshold for a research or clinical classification of psychopathy, though the instrument was explicitly designed as a dimensional measure of degree, not a simple present or absent diagnosis. Hare's research identified two correlated but distinct factors underlying the checklist. Factor 1 captures the interpersonal and affective core Cleckley originally described: glib and superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, conning and manipulative behavior, lack of remorse, shallow affect, callousness, and failure to accept responsibility for one's own actions. Factor 2 captures a more behavioral, lifestyle-oriented pattern: a need for stimulation and proneness to boredom, a parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioral controls, early behavioral problems, lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility, juvenile delinquency, and criminal versatility. This two-factor structure matters because the two dimensions do not always travel together in equal measure. Some individuals score high on the interpersonal and affective traits of Factor 1, while showing relatively controlled, stable, even successful lifestyles, precisely the profile that later researchers would use to describe the so-called successful psychopath, someone whose Factor 1 traits are pronounced but whose Factor 2, impulsivity and criminality, remain comparatively muted. Of all the traits on Hare's checklist, superficial charm is the one most directly relevant to body language and first impressions, because it is often the very first thing that misleads an observer, including trained professionals who should, in theory, know better. Clinicians and researchers who have interviewed high-scoring individuals consistently describe a specific quality to this charm. It is fluent, confident, and remarkably well-calibrated to what the listener wants to hear, but it tends to lack the small imperfections, hesitations, and genuine emotional texture that characterize ordinary rapport. Where an honest, emotionally engaged person's warmth tends to fluctuate naturally with the conversation, this charm often runs at a strikingly consistent, almost performed level regardless of the topic, a smoothness that researchers describe as compelling in the moment and, in retrospect, slightly uncanny. Grandiosity shows up alongside this charm in a specific, recognizable pattern: an unshakable, often disproportionate confidence in one's own abilities, intelligence, or importance, expressed not as boastful insecurity, but as calm, matter-of-fact certainty. Pathological lying compounds this further, and Hare's research specifically notes that high scorers often lie even when the truth would serve them just as well or better, and often continue lying smoothly even after being confronted with clear contradicting evidence, showing little of the physiological discomfort discussed in our third file on statement analysis and deception. This combination, fluent charm plus grandiosity plus frictionless lying, is precisely what makes high scorers so difficult to detect through ordinary conversation alone. The deception cues our third file described, hesitation, incongruent gestures, verbal hedging, largely depend on the liar experiencing some internal conflict about the lie. Individuals high in this factor frequently do not experience that conflict, which is exactly why body language researchers have had to look elsewhere, beyond conversational fluency, for reliable markers. If Factor 1's interpersonal traits explain how high scorers get past our initial defenses, the affective traits explain what happens once someone has actually been harmed, and why the aftermath so often feels, to victims and investigators alike, deeply wrong in a way that is hard to name precisely. Shallow affect refers to a documented pattern of emotional expression that is technically present but strikingly brief, poorly modulated, or oddly mismatched to context. Researchers studying this pattern have noted that high scorers can produce apparently genuine tears or anger, but these displays tend to switch on and off with unusual speed, and often seem calibrated more to their effect on an audience than to any sustained internal state, a pattern strikingly different from the ordinary, harder to fully control emotional bleed we all show during genuinely difficult moments. Lack of remorse is perhaps the single most consistently reported affective marker across decades of case interviews, and it is worth being precise about what it actually looks like in practice. It is rarely open bragging. Far more often, clinicians describe a kind of puzzled detachment, an individual who can recite the appropriate words of regret fluently because they have learned which words are expected, while showing no accompanying physiological signature of genuine distress and sometimes visibly losing interest in the topic once the expected script has been delivered. Callousness rounds out this affective cluster, a documented lack of empathy specifically for the suffering of others, distinct from the charm and grandiosity of Factor 1, which concern how someone treats their own image. Researchers studying victim interviews across many cases note a recurring disorienting detail. Victims and survivors often report that what disturbed them most in retrospect was not overt cruelty in the moment, but a specific, chilling flatness that surfaced the instant the performance of concern was no longer required. Ted Bundy remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of Factor 1 traits operating at full strength in a serial offender, precisely because so many people who knew him, including law enforcement colleagues, described him in terms that seem almost impossible to reconcile with his crimes. Bundy was, by nearly every contemporary account, articulate, conventionally attractive, and socially skilled enough to work on a Seattle crisis hotline, volunteer for a state crime commission studying rape prevention, and maintain long-term romantic relationships throughout the period of his offenses. He frequently used a staged injury, a fake cast, or a sling as a manipulation tactic to elicit help from women he then attacked, a calculated exploitation of ordinary human empathy that required him to convincingly perform vulnerability while feeling none of the corresponding distress himself. During his later trials, observers repeatedly noted a demeanor that seemed strikingly incongruent with the proceedings. Composed, at times almost cheerful, engaging with the press and even representing himself in court with evident enjoyment of the spotlight. This is not, contrary to how it is sometimes portrayed in dramatized retellings, evidence of secret intelligence or a special criminal genius. Researchers studying the case since have pointed to it as a textbook illustration of exactly the effective flatness and grandiosity the checklist describes, a defendant seemingly unable to generate the emotional register the situation called for, substituting performance and self-regard instead. It is worth being careful here about what this case does and does not demonstrate. Bundy is often used as a shorthand for psychopathy in popular media, specifically because his charm was so well documented and so thoroughly at odds with his crimes, but no single case, however well documented, should be treated as defining an entire clinical category. He is useful here as an illustration of traits described abstractly in the previous two chapters, not as a stand-in for every individual who scores high on Hare's checklist, the vast majority of whom never commit anything close to Bundy's crimes. Beyond the checklist's interview-based criteria, researchers have specifically studied a nonverbal pattern frequently described anecdotally by survivors, investigators, and clinicians alike. An unusually intense, prolonged, and oddly unblinking quality to eye contact from high-scoring individuals, sometimes informally called the predatory stare. Ordinary human eye contact follows a well-documented rhythm, breaking away periodically as a signal of comfort, social calibration, and shared emotional processing, a pattern present even in infancy. Clinical interviewers working with high-scoring individuals have repeatedly noted eye contact that departs from this rhythm, holding steady well past the point where an ordinary conversational partner would look away, functioning less like an instinctive social signal and more like a deliberate, almost assessing form of observation, as though the other person were being read rather than related to. This should be treated with real caution as a standalone signal, since intense eye contact has many innocent explanations, from cultural norms to simple personality variation to conditions entirely unrelated to psychopathy. What researchers emphasize is not the eye contact alone, but its combination with the emotional flatness described in Chapter 5. prolonged eye contact paired with a face that is not simultaneously generating the small, continuous emotional signals ordinary rapport produces is a considerably more specific pattern than intense eye contact by itself. Survivors of encounters with documented psychopathic offenders have frequently described this exact combination after the fact, often in strikingly similar language. A sense of being looked at rather than seen, a stare that lingered without the accompanying warmth or curiosity that would normally make prolonged attention feel like connection rather than evaluation. One of the more rigorously studied nonverbal markers of psychopathy involves a phenomenon most people never consciously notice in themselves: emotional mimicry. The automatic, largely involuntary tendency of the human face to subtly echo the expressions of people we are interacting with. Part of the same emotional contagion system that lets a room full of people absorb one another's mood without a single word being exchanged. Researchers using facial electromyography, sensors that detect minute muscle activity invisible to the naked eye, have found that individuals scoring high on psychopathy checklists show measurably reduced automatic mimicry when shown images of others' emotional expressions, particularly distress and fear, compared to control subjects, whose facial muscles register a faint, involuntary echo of what they are viewing within a fraction of a second, often before conscious awareness even registers the stimulus. This finding connects directly back to Paul Ekman's research from our second file, where Ekman's work established that genuine emotion produces largely involuntary, hard-to-fake facial signatures. This mimicry research suggests something further. High-scoring individuals may not just be capable of suppressing their own outward emotional display, they may also be failing to automatically register other people's emotional states through the same low-level neural pathway the rest of us rely on without ever noticing it is running. This is a subtle marker, invisible to casual observation and detectable only through sensitive instrumentation in controlled settings. So it belongs in this file as an explanation of what likely underlies the more visible flatness described in Chapter 5, rather than as something an ordinary observer could reliably detect in the moment. It matters here because it suggests the affective gap in psychopathy is not merely a performance choice, but something closer to a genuine, measurable difference in automatic emotional processing. A separate and equally well-documented line of research looks not at facial mimicry but at the startle reflex, the automatic, protective eye blink response triggered by a sudden loud noise, one of the most primitive and hardest to consciously override reactions in the human nervous system. In non-psychopathic subjects, this startle response is reliably amplified when the person is simultaneously viewing an unpleasant or threatening image, a well-established phenomenon researchers call fear-potentiated startle, reflecting the way an already activated threat system intensifies a subsequent protective reflex. Neuroscientist James Blair and several other researchers studying psychopathy found that individuals scoring high on Hare's checklist show a markedly reduced version of this amplification. Their blink response to the same startling noise barely changes whether they are looking at a threatening image or a neutral one. This pattern lines up closely with structural and functional brain imaging research pointing to reduced activity and, in some studies, reduced volume in the amygdala, a small structure deep in the brain central to processing fear and threat-related learning among high-scoring individuals. Researchers have proposed that this reduced amygdala reactivity may help explain several traits already discussed in this file: a diminished capacity to learn from punishment, a blunted experience of fear in situations that would provoke anxiety in almost anyone else, and a corresponding fearlessness that can look, to an outside observer, remarkably like courage. It is worth emphasizing what this research does not claim. A blunted startle response or reduced amygdala activity does not, on its own, mean someone is dangerous, and plenty of people with atypical fear responses for entirely different medical reasons never harm anyone. What this research does provide is a biological plausibility argument for why the checklist's effective items cluster together as consistently as they do across completely different individuals and cultures. Our second file introduced duping delight, Paul Ekman's term for the brief, involuntary flash of pleasure that can leak across a liar's face specifically when they believe they are successfully deceiving someone, particularly someone with high stakes or perceived intelligence. In the context of psychopathy, this phenomenon takes on a specific, amplified character worth returning to directly, Because grandiosity and manipulation are core, defining traits rather than occasional tactics for high-scoring individuals, researchers studying recorded interviews and interrogations have noted that duping delight appears to surface more frequently and, in some documented cases, more visibly in this population. Precisely because successfully deceiving another person functions as a direct, repeated confirmation of the grandiose self-image Chapter 4 described, not merely a means to a practical end. This produces a specific, recognizable pattern investigators are trained to watch for: a fleeting, asymmetric smile, or a brief brightening around the eyes appearing at a moment in an interview that has no obvious reason to produce pleasure, often immediately following a lie the interviewer has not yet caught, or immediately after successfully redirecting a line of questioning. Where an ordinary deceptive person's duping delight tends to be tightly suppressed by simultaneous anxiety about getting caught, the reduced fear response described in Chapter 9 may leave less internal competition to mask this particular tell. As with every marker in this file, this is a probabilistic signal rather than a certainty, and experienced interviewers are careful to treat a single flash of apparent pleasure as one data point to be weighed against the fuller pattern of interpersonal, affective, and lifestyle traits covered throughout this video, not as a standalone verdict. Aggression researchers draw a distinction directly relevant to reading body language in high-stakes encounters. Reactive aggression, the hot, impulsive, physiologically aroused response to a perceived provocation or threat, versus instrumental aggression, cold, planned, goal-directed violence used as a deliberate tool rather than an emotional discharge. Most human aggression, including most violent crime, is reactive. A bar fight escalating from an insult, a domestic dispute turning physical in a moment of genuine emotional flooding. This kind of aggression typically shows visible physiological arousal beforehand: flushed skin, raised voice, rapid breathing, clenched posture, the same fight-or-flight signature discussed throughout this series. Instrumental aggression, by contrast, is documented as occurring with strikingly little corresponding arousal, a calm, sometimes almost bored demeanor persisting right up to and during an act of serious violence. Research specifically comparing psychopathic and non-psychopathic violent offenders has found that psychopathic offenders account for a disproportionate share of instrumental, premeditated violence relative to their numbers, while showing comparatively less of the reactive, emotionally driven violence that dominates non-psychopathic offending. This lines up precisely with the reduced fear and arousal responses covered in Chapter 9. A nervous system less activated by threat and less amplified by an audience's distress produces violence that looks and feels qualitatively different to witnesses. This distinction has direct, practical value for anyone trying to read a tense situation in real time. A person escalating with visible reactive arousal, however frightening in the moment, is generally responding to something and can often be de-escalated by addressing that underlying trigger. A person maintaining calm, controlled affect while behaving in a genuinely threatening way is showing a pattern researchers specifically associate with instrumental violence, and calm in that specific context should be read as a warning sign rather than reassurance. To see these markers working together rather than in isolation, walk through a composite interview scenario with us, built from patterns common across documented cases rather than any one specific file. A suspect in an unsolved assault case is brought in for a voluntary interview. Within the first few minutes, the interviewing detective, trained in the same statement analysis principles from our third file, notices a specific quality to the suspect's rapport: fluent, warm, almost flattering toward the detective personally, precisely the frictionless charm described in Chapter 4. When asked directly about the incident, the suspect maintains prolonged, steady eye contact without the natural breaks in gaze that typically accompany genuine recall, the pattern described in Chapter 7. Midway through the interview, the detective deliberately mentions a false piece of evidence, a technique discussed in our fourth file's chapter on baiting and communicated threats, watching closely for the reaction. The suspect's face registers a brief, asymmetric flicker at one corner of the mouth before smoothly and calmly denying any connection to the fabricated detail, a possible instance of the duping delight described in Chapter 10, though the detective notes it as one observation among many rather than a conclusion on its own. When the conversation turns to the victim directly, the suspect produces words of concern that are technically appropriate, expressing hope that the victim recovers. But the detective notices the emotional register switches on and off with unusual speed. present exactly as long as the topic is being directly addressed and gone the instant the conversation moves elsewhere. The shallow affect pattern from Chapter 5. Taken individually, none of these observations would justify any conclusion. Documented together, in a single structured interview, they represent exactly the kind of convergent, multi-marker pattern the checklist was designed to formalize. Our third file covered the read technique and the serious risk of false confessions it can produce with vulnerable, suggestible, or highly anxious suspects. Psychopathic suspects present, in many documented respects, the opposite challenge. Considerably more resistant to standard pressure tactics precisely because the techniques rely on provoking anxiety, guilt, or a need to relieve psychological discomfort. Exactly the internal states, Factor 1 and Factor 2 traits tend to blunt. Investigators and forensic psychologists who specialize in interviewing high-scoring individuals have documented a recurring pattern: standard confrontational techniques designed to build pressure until a suspect breaks, often simply fail to generate the expected discomfort, sometimes producing instead a suspect who appears mildly entertained by the detective's effort. A dynamic some interviewers describe as feeling like the roles have quietly reversed. What researchers and experienced interviewers have found more effective is appealing directly to the grandiosity and need for admiration. Chapter 4 described framing questions as an opportunity for the suspect to demonstrate superior intelligence or control over the narrative, rather than an opportunity to relieve guilt they may not genuinely feel. This approach carries its own real risks and ethical complexities, since it deliberately works with a suspect's manipulative tendencies rather than against them. And departments that use it require specific training to avoid crossing into tactics that could taint the reliability of any resulting statement. The core lesson connects directly back to our third file's central theme. Technique without an accurate read of the person across the table is dangerous in both directions, producing false confessions from the vulnerable and producing nothing at all from those whose psychological makeup renders standard pressure tactics essentially inert. Robert Hare, working with organizational psychologist Paul Babiak, extended this entire body of research beyond prisons and courtrooms in their book Snakes in Suits, examining how the same Factor 1 traits, charm, grandiosity, manipulation, that make for a compelling prison interview also make for a strikingly effective corporate resume and interview performance. Their research, including a specific corporate study assessing psychopathy scores among management professionals, found that measurable psychopathic traits appeared at meaningfully higher rates in senior corporate populations than in the general population, concentrated particularly in high visibility, high-stakes roles where confident public performance and calm handling of pressure are directly rewarded, and where the checklist's Factor 2 impulsivity and criminality often remain comparatively suppressed by structure, oversight, and the practical incentive to maintain a functional public image. The behavioral markers in a corporate setting closely mirror what this file has already described. Fluent charm that wins over interview panels quickly, a striking talent for identifying and exploiting organizational blind spots, an ability to take credit for others' work with genuine seeming confidence rather than visible guilt, and a callous willingness to damage colleagues' careers when convenient, all wrapped in a professional polish that makes the underlying pattern far harder for colleagues and even trained human resources professionals to recognize than the more obviously disturbing presentation associated with criminal cases. Babiak and Hare's research specifically cautions against treating every ambitious, charming, or ruthless executive as clinically psychopathic. The point of this research is narrower and more useful. Certain organizational environments, particularly those prizing bold decisiveness and charismatic public performance over demonstrated collaborative track record, may inadvertently select for exactly the traits this file has spent 13 chapters describing, which is a structural problem worth naming rather than a reason for casual diagnosis of any specific coworker. The same rigor that makes the PCLR clinically useful has also made it controversial in one specific high-stakes application: its use in criminal sentencing, and particularly in the United States in capital cases, where a high psychopathy score has sometimes been presented to juries as evidence of future dangerousness justifying a death sentence. Researchers including Jennifer Scheme and David Cook have published influential critiques arguing that the PCLR was designed and validated as a research and clinical assessment tool, not as a precise predictive instrument for an individual's specific future behavior, and that presenting a single numerical score to a jury risks conveying a false impression of scientific certainty about something the underlying research does not actually support with that degree of precision. A related concern involves the checklist's reliance on file review and interviewer judgment, both of which introduce room for inconsistency between evaluators, particularly in adversarial court settings where one side's expert and the other side's expert, reviewing the same file, have in documented instances produced meaningfully different scores, a pattern that undermines the instrument's claim to objective, courtroom-ready precision, even though it performs considerably more consistently in structured research settings. None of this criticism suggests the underlying science is invalid. It suggests, specifically and narrowly, that a tool built for research and clinical treatment planning carries real risk when repurposed for the highest stakes legal decisions our justice system makes, exactly the caution this entire series has applied to every method covered so far, from micro-expressions to interrogation technique to predictive profiling. Beyond courtroom misuse, researchers have raised more fundamental questions about how consistently the checklist's traits translate across different cultural contexts, since the PCLR was developed and validated primarily on North American and disproportionately male correctional populations. Studies attempting to replicate the checklist's two-factor structure in other countries and cultural settings have produced mixed results, with some traits, particularly the more behaviorally observable Factor 2 items, replicating fairly consistently, while some Factor 1 interpersonal items show more variation, plausibly reflecting genuine cultural differences in what counts as appropriately confident self-presentation versus grandiosity, or what counts as normal emotional restraint versus concerning flatness. Researchers have also raised specific concerns about how the checklist performs when applied to women, since it was developed and validated predominantly on male samples, with some studies suggesting certain items may manifest differently or be systematically under- or over-detected in female offenders, an active area of ongoing research rather than a settled question. This body of criticism reinforces a theme running throughout this entire file. Even a rigorously validated, widely respected clinical instrument has documented boundaries on where and to whom it applies with full confidence, and treating any single tool as a universal, culture-blind measure of a fundamentally social and interpersonal set of traits is precisely the kind of overreach the instrument's own developers have repeatedly cautioned against. It is worth dedicating a full chapter to a point this file has already raised several times, because it is the single most commonly distorted takeaway from this entire body of research. The overwhelming majority of people who would score high on Hare's checklist never commit murder, and a great many never commit any crime serious enough to bring them into contact with the criminal justice system at all. Researchers distinguish between what is sometimes informally called successful psychopathy, individuals whose Factor 1 traits are pronounced, but whose impulse control, intelligence, or simple good fortune keep them out of the criminal justice system entirely, and the more extensively studied unsuccessful or incarcerated psychopathy that dominates the checklist's original validation samples, since prisons are, naturally, where researchers had the most concentrated and available access to study the trait in depth. This distinction matters because it reframes the entire purpose of this file. The goal was never to teach viewers to identify a rare monster hiding among ordinary people. It is to describe a real, measurable, dimensional set of traits that exists on a spectrum throughout the general population. Traits that become genuinely dangerous only in specific individuals, under specific circumstances, combined with specific behavioral histories, exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost when a clinical category becomes a casual insult. Understanding this distinction is also, frankly, the responsible way to end a video that has spent 16 chapters describing unsettling traits, with a clear reminder that observing one or two of these markers in someone you know is not evidence of anything close to what this file's case studies describe, and that responsible pattern recognition means looking for the full convergent picture, not a single data point pulled out of context. As with every file in this series, the most transferable lesson here has little to do with catching a serial killer and everything to do with everyday judgment. The specific markers covered in this video, frictionless charm without emotional texture, emotional displays that switch on and off with unusual speed, calm persisting through situations that should provoke visible discomfort, a pattern of taking credit and avoiding consequences without any visible internal friction, are useful less as a diagnostic checklist and more as a prompt to trust a specific, nameable form of unease. Many people who have been deceived, manipulated, or harmed by someone high in these traits describe, in retrospect, having felt something was subtly wrong well before they could articulate what, often dismissing that instinct because the person's words and surface presentation gave them no concrete reason to. This file exists partly to give that instinct a vocabulary. If someone's emotional responses feel technically correct but somehow hollow, if their calm in a crisis feels less like composure and more like absence, that specific mismatch is worth taking seriously rather than talking yourself out of. At the same time, everything in Chapter 17 still applies here. This vocabulary is a tool for calibrating your own instincts more precisely, not a license to diagnose acquaintances, co-workers, or exes from a distance. The responsible use of everything in this file is entirely private, noticing a pattern, trusting the specific unease it produces, and adjusting your own boundaries accordingly, not assigning a clinical label to someone who has never been assessed by a trained professional. Current research on psychopathy is increasingly moving away from a single checklist model and toward a broader, dimensional understanding, examining genetic contributions, early childhood risk factors including callous, unemotional traits observable in some children well before adolescence, and the specific environmental conditions that appear to push a genetic predisposition toward either the successful or unsuccessful expression of these traits described in Chapter 17. Neuroscience research continues to refine the amygdala and startle response findings from Chapter 9 using more sophisticated brain imaging, while mimicry researchers continue extending the facial electromyography work from Chapter 8 into real-time interaction studies rather than static image viewing, aiming to capture how these deficits actually play out across a live, back-and-forth conversation rather than a controlled laboratory stimulus. Treatment research remains the field's most difficult open question. Traditional talk therapy approaches, which generally rely on a patient's motivation to reduce their own emotional discomfort, have shown limited effectiveness with high-scoring individuals precisely because that internal discomfort is often exactly what is blunted. Though more recent structured programs focused on concrete incentive systems and early intervention with high-risk children have shown more encouraging, though still preliminary, results. The through line connecting this file to every other file in this series is the same one John Douglas applied to prediction, the same one Paul Ekman applied to micro-expressions, the same one this channel applies to every method covered here. Real behavioral science is powerful precisely because it is specific, falsifiable, and bounded, and it becomes dangerous the moment it is treated as a simple, universal shortcut for judging other human beings. This video covered the specific, researched behavioral markers of psychopathy, Cleckley's original mask of sanity, Hare's checklist and its two factors, the charm and grandiosity that let high scorers past our first defenses, the shallow affect and absent remorse that surface once someone is actually harmed, the predatory stare, the measurable mimicry and startle response deficits underlying that flatness, duping delight in its most amplified form, instrumental violence, corporate psychopathy, and the real courtroom controversies and cross-cultural limits of the checklist itself. Across 5 files now, we have covered how the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit learned to reconstruct a crime scene, read a face, survive an interrogation room, predict an active offender's next move, and now recognize the mask some of the most dangerous people ever studied learned to wear. Every method in this series comes with the same warning attached: powerful, specific, and always bounded by real limits. If you want to keep building this same toolkit, the next file returns to the crime scene itself, examining how forensic evidence and behavioral analysis work together on a single case from first response to conviction. Subscribe now so you do not miss it. This was the 5th file.